Well, welcome to our second panel on climate change regulation. My name is Brian Franey. I'm a partner at Manco Gold, Ketcher and Fox. I'm also an adjunct professor here at Villanova Law, teaching a class called environmental lawyering. So for for the students in the audience and interested in environmental law, this is my small 5-second plug to join the class, which is coming again in 2020, spring of 2020. So with me today, we have three distinguished panelists. We have, starting on the far left, is Debbie Mans, who is Deputy Commissioner at New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. In the middle is Kathleen Robertson, who is a Senior Manager for Environmental Policy and Wholesale Market Development at Exelon, which is quite a mouthful of a job title.
Never fits in the box.
Is there an acronym for it?
Not a good one.
Not a good one. And then we have Rob Altenburg, who is the Director of PennFuture's Energy Center. So the theme today, obviously, is regulatory uncertainty, which is particularly relevant to climate change regulation. And I want to key off one word in there, and that's regulation. So our state and federal response to climate change has mostly taken the form of regulation. Obviously, as John pointed out, you have to have the statutory authority, but the way we, at the government level, is reacting is through regulation. So one obvious problem with the regulatory-based approach to limiting carbon emissions is that every time you have a change in executive branch control, you may have a completely different philosophy and approach to how you interpret your statutory authority. So we've obviously seen this at the federal level with the Trump administration, where the word climate change is a bad word. It's completely, every single Obama administration climate change initiative has been abandoned, reversed, or just not followed. We've seen this at the state level, and Debbie will be able to talk about this in just a minute. At New Jersey, with the switch from the Christie to the Murphy administration, we've also seen this in Pennsylvania as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Debbie in a second and just talk about her experience with this, with the transition that's underway in New Jersey, where for years there was an abandonment of the focus on climate change, and now there's a new renewed focus on limiting carbon emissions. So Debbie, if you could briefly explain the transition that's underway in New Jersey.
Sure. So my one-year anniversary of coming into the administration is next week. And actually before that I was in an NGO, and I was a client of Alice's. So I had a very different hat on. And so one of the first things that was a bit different in New Jersey is we could put climate change back up on the website for our New Jersey DEP, and that was really one of the questions that we had. So we were kind of starting a little bit from scratch in New Jersey. We hadn't done much. And one of the first things that Governor Murphy directed us to do was to get back into rejoin the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. As you know, or probably know, we were in it briefly before the governor, Christie, withdrew the state. And I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later, is the administrative function versus the legislative function, and how that can really put into a lot of uncertainty, because one person can withdraw the state from this market mechanism. So right now the rules are out for public comment. There's actually two rules around rejoining RGGI, the auction mechanism, and also where the funds go, the funding. And so that has to be in place, and what our goal is to be in the auction, in the first auction in 2020. We're also in the midst of redoing our energy master plan in New Jersey. The Board of Public Utilities is taking the lead on that, and that is a long-term look at energy in the state. And that's going to help inform where we are at the DEP with the Global Warming Response Act. There were obligations under that. That's a law from about 10 years ago that we just really weren't doing the reporting under. We're supposed to have a report of our pathways to get to 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That report was due in 2010, and the agency simply didn't do it. And so we are in the process of working on that, but we need the baseline of the Energy Master Plan to help us input that into our pathways to getting to that reduction. The other thing that's underway in New Jersey is a huge push for offshore wind. The BPU put out a solicitation for 110 megawatts of offshore wind, which is I think the largest in the country. We're reevaluating the solar programming for financing and how that's financed. And then the last thing that we just signed on to is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which Pennsylvania also signed on to, which I thought was great. And this is looking at greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. So we have a lot going on, and I'm sure everyone trying to do projects in the energy sector are just trying to figure out where this is all going to sort through and land, and there's a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to do our best to be transparent and have a lot of stakeholder meetings and provide some certainty as we put out these reports and this guidance. So that's the transition in New Jersey, so stay tuned.
So if I can follow that before we turn it over to Rob and Kathleen, is there thought to how you make this more permanent so that in 3 years you don't have an entirely new regime that's in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point our legislature, now understanding that certain bills would be signed by a Democratic governor, we're seeing legislation again around climate change, global warming, and trying to get more interim standards, maybe around 2030 put in place. But, there also was discussion about how you make it more onerous to withdraw a state from RGGI. But, I point back to, we had obligations under the law to do certain reporting, and the agency just didn't. So, not only do we need the law, but we need some accountability around the law. So I think that's, that would be my only kind of, opinion around that.
Kathleen, if I can get the private sector reaction to that. So how does your organization react to that, the constant change in climate policy at both the state and the federal level?
So I'm going to break that apart a little bit, and I know you gave a question ahead of me, but I'm still going to break it apart and dispute the premise. So in some ways, I think that there's the kind of the churn of the constant change. We work, obviously, in the federal government because we're a U.S. company, and we do work across all 48 states. We're heavily involved in some, including New Jersey, who's really become one of my favorites lately. But so we do deal with a lot of churn and a lot of changes in the regulatory environment and go back and forth. But I think that the real thing that we struggle with and that has been a real kind of harm to our business is that kind of whoever's running the show, particularly, I'm going to talk more about the federal level because that's what I do. It's actually very certain and consistent in its lack of ambition and lack of actual climate change requirements and obligations. I mean, despite the rending of garments over the Clean Power Plan, it was basically just locking in the business as usual trends for the power sector. It really didn't require anybody to make any wholesale changes of the type that I think we all agree are necessary. And it preserved, because it focused so narrowly on one portion of the power sector, it didn't really address the wealth of other things in the federal government that work against that incentive. So fossil fuel subsidies and all of that. So in our industry, speaking just for the power sector, the larger drivers, besides federal regulation at this point and for the foreseeable future, are consumer demand, business requirements, basic economics. I mean, what you've seen as reduction in the power sector lately are just a switch from coal to natural gas, which is definitely a good thing in the direction. But it's not enough to get the reductions we need, and it has a lot of knock-on effects on cleaner energy. And then the liability and enforcement concerns. I think John Crude teed that up really well, but there are a lot of fossil companies starting to be more concerned about how they play and how much of the climate change aspects that we're seeing they're going to be held liable for, which I think we are teeing up for later. But I think altogether those are far more important drivers to us right now than the change in federal policy, just because what they're aiming for is so low. So while we are spending a boatload on litigation and other advocacy to try to preserve the authority to write the standards themselves weren't what was driving our business.
So Rob, I'll turn it over to you, and hopefully you can give us the Pennsylvania perspective, and if you can briefly explain what's happening at the moment in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, well, there's a number of things going on right now. climate change in general, Governor Wolf just signed an executive order that set some goals for the state. We haven't seen any regulatory action on that. We don't expect anything in the immediate future. But there is a petition that has been filed in front of the EQB to do a cap-and-trade program, an economy-wide cap-and-trade program. And what this is based on is the idea that the science tells us that we need to significantly reduce our emission reductions, 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And this is a petition to say, DEP, you have the authority to regulate this under your existing authority under the Air Pollution Control Act. And not only that, Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania State Constitution, our Environmental Rights Amendment, gives you a trust responsibility to actually regulate in this area. So there's this petition out there, and the state petition process, any citizen can petition the DEP to enact regulation. And there's a number of co-petitioners on this. This starts a fairly long process. This could easily take a couple of years to resolve whether or not the DEP is going to move forward with a regulatory package based on this petition. And once they move forward, a relatively non-controversial regulation takes 18 months, well, 2 years to 18 months to actually accomplish. And this could take considerably longer than that. So we're not expecting this petition to result in immediate regulatory change, but it really puts some of the issues on the table. And what does the state have to do under Article 1, Section 27? And we expect to see that conversation continue to be going on here for the next couple of years.
Right. So that really fits into the bottom-up thesis that John introduced. Is that this is all coming up from the citizens and trying to get the state to act. So I'm going to put this question to the group. So the Trump administration's vowed to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. The earliest date of that withdrawal happens to be the day after the next presidential election, November 4th, 2020. So obviously the Trump administration could still withdraw, and if there's a new Democratic administration, it could come back. But I want to get your perspective on this uncertain future about our participation in that treaty.
Well, I don't think the future on climate change is uncertain at all, regardless of where the federal government lands. So I basically, had a midlife crisis, telling Alice last year, and I also ran for my local town council. And so not only did we decide as a state in New Jersey with Governor Murphy to adhere to the Paris Climate Accords, we decided as a municipality as well. So I think that is just going to, continue to be the trend in the absence of leadership at the federal level, and companies and your clients should anticipate that as where we're headed.
Yeah, I think similarly, that sucks that we've played this role on the national stage. I know I should have better language in a law school symposium, but it just sucks. It looked bad, and it really harms kind of where we're trying to go with all of this. But I think to Debbie's point, and having Governor Wolf, while it's just an executive order and it's not in any way legally or regulatorily binding yet, I think even just having the goals down on paper was a good thing. I mean, until this year, Pennsylvania didn't even have a greenhouse gas target on paper to aim at, much less to actually implement. So I think that while it's obviously insufficient if you don't do, as Debbie mentioned, do anything to achieve it, I think having those goals out there to achieve that also kind of helps you craft it serves as the umbrella around other policies. Like you've seen in New Jersey, they have the goals out there, and now they're joining TCI and rejoining RGGI. Side note to all the future legislative drafters out there, shall join RGGI is much more powerful than may join RGGI. There's a good switch. Yeah. Thank you. So I think that's one way you can manage uncertainty is if you like your law, use a lot more shalls than mays, because your executive could change a lot, as we've seen at all levels of government of late. And then TCI, RGGI, the clean energy standards, they all kind of hang off of this direction that the targets have given them. So I'm really glad to see Pennsylvania doing that.
And I totally agree, and we certainly support the Wolf administration's executive order on this. But part of this, when it goes to uncertainty, in and out of Paris, I don't think really added much uncertainty. The Paris goals, the national determined contributions of Paris, basically were aligned with the Clean Power Plan. And that was the glide path, what our energy sector was on pretty much. There wasn't a whole lot that needed to be done to get to that 2030 goal. Now, to get to the next level of what we actually need to do to address climate change is a much more significant step, and that is not at all on the glide path of what we've been set up to achieve. But in or out of Paris, we'd probably meet it even if we were not in it. For all the Trump administration's talk about bringing coal back, it's not happening.
Well, great. So Rob had mentioned this in passing, but he talked about the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change. They put out a report last October that concluded to prevent a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to cut global emissions of greenhouse gases by 45% if you compare it against the 2010 levels by 2030, and to be net zero by 2050. And that's what Rob's talking about. That's going to be really the major lift. So barring cost-effective carbon capture, meeting these targets is going to have major impacts on the fossil fuel sector and the fuel mix of our country. So much of the proven oil reserves are going to need to stay in the ground. Pennsylvania is a major producer of natural gas. I believe we're now number 2 in the country. So you have potentially an entire industry being disrupted within the next 30 years. So I want to just start more general and talking about is net zero in 30 years, is that a realistic goal? And I understand the environmental implications, but I just want to start broadly and then we'll start narrowing down that.
Well, I can push back a little bit on the question with whether or not it's realistic. I think one of the things that we have to address is it fair? What the IPCC goals reflect is that there is an international climate budget that the world needs to meet to prevent significant global warming. And by any calculation, the U.S. has more than used its share of that carbon budget already. When we talk about what needs to be done, we necessarily have to talk about how to divide the remaining carbon budget among states. And hitting net zero by 2050 is actually the U.S. continuing to do more than it probably should on any equitable basis compared to the other states. That being said, net zero by 2050 is a really challenging goal. There are certainly things I think we can do to accelerate particularly in our energy sector, particularly in our transportation sector, to accelerate towards that. But yeah, it's going to be a hard stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll call back to something from one of the other panels where they talked about the moonshot. I mean, just to keep using a really good analogy, like, we didn't know if we could do that either. I mean, historians will remind you that when Kennedy made that speech, there was actually a debate whether he was going to say moon or Mars, because they both seemed equally crazy. So I say let's aim for it. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, but it's going to be very bad if we don't at least get some of the way there. And I mean, at the risk of having things thrown at me, sitting here in Pennsylvania arguing for net emissions, I would also just point out that it's got to happen. But also, just remember there's a lot of other uses for natural gas besides burning it for electricity or cook stoves and whatnot. I think Pennsylvania has a real opportunity if they think broader beyond just essentially burning the natural gas. The chemical industry and everything else are opportunities. So without actually speaking to the viability of CCS, I think that shouldn't hold Pennsylvania back from actually considering action, from actually taking action. You need to stop considering it.
Right, I mean, I'll agree with Rob. I mean, it is challenging, but that's the point of setting out a goal and a target. I think in New Jersey in particular, the transportation, which is over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, is going to be a challenge for us. But hopefully, this type of conversation, which is now happening at the federal level with the new Green Deal conversation, will start, spurring that a little bit more.
And there was an argument related to the setting national ambient air quality standards for ozone, where it was argued that since we can't determine exactly what is health protective, you almost shouldn't do anything. There's people arguing, we can't do enough, so let's not start. And that's just the wrong direction.
So I'll put this question to Rob then. So who should bear the burden of risk for the economic loss that businesses may suffer during this transition?
Well, businesses are making decisions every day. They have been. We're seeing an acceleration of things like folks divesting from fossil fuels in their portfolio. Companies, certainly large companies like you see Amazon and Google making a lot of their siting decisions on the ability to have clean renewable energy at their siting. So businesses are already making decisions. I was at a conference, it was in the Bush administration, where folks from the World Bank came to DC and they were discussing how businesses should prepare and address for what they eventually need to do for climate change. There's been a lot of notice that things are going to happen. If businesses decide to continue to take the risk of relying on that fossil fuel investment, they should be well aware that that might not pay off.
Yeah, I think just if I could tag on that, as far as who should bear the risk, I mean, I think that we need to remember that people are bearing the risk now. Currently it's the poorest and the ones who benefit least from the status quo. And the idea that we're talking about this in a vacuum as if no one is currently bearing the risk of climate change itself is, I think, lends to a lot of false decisions and frankly a lot of inertia about getting started because no one wants to tag anyone with the cost of doing something, but we're being tagged with the cost of it now. I mean, you can certainly speak to what's going on around the shore and the effects of Hurricane Sandy, but I mean, speaking from our generation, our utility fleet, we are spending a boatload of money either repairing from storms, preparing for the next storm, building our substations higher than they historically had to have been, picking up all the power lines that get knocked down in more extreme weather. There are a lot of costs now, and there are carbon prices now. They're just completely irrational and unintentional.
And I'm sure others can speak more eloquently on this, but there is a suite of lawsuits happening now, right, out of California and New York City that are, against some of the fossil fuel companies about that cost or fraud or anything like that. And I think those are just really interesting pieces to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, bringing up California, as far as, kind of the business costs of climate change, for anyone not paying attention, PG&E has just announced, actually their second bankruptcy, but depending on how you're counting, it's either the first or at least the largest climate change related bankruptcy from the wildfire costs that they're currently bearing out there. And I think that particularly in our industry, but I think also more broadly, has given a lot of companies pause as you say, is that the inaction or the uncertainty, however you want to phrase it, at the federal level, doesn't mean that just because the regulatory environment hasn't figured out what's happening, like your town is still burning down, your substation is still burning down, your company is going bankrupt, and you need to figure out how to do that. And I think that really is one of the things that links all three of these panels together is kind of the secret hammer of underneath the exact rule book of the regulatory landscape is kind of the issue of whether you call it enforcement or liability or essentially just all of these ignored costs catching up to you. I mean, you touched on some of the fraud cases, but I think I'm going to challenge for the next year's symposium. I think the more important one is actually the investor relations case against Exelon of, look, you knew climate change was real regardless of what you said out loud. You knew it and you did not take steps to protect shareholders. So this is largely around shareholders, but I think that the utility industry in particular is looking real hard at that because we know, everyone knows climate change is real and it's getting worse, even if we stopped emitting right now. What do we have to do to protect our business, to protect our customers? And if we don't do enough, that seems like that's going to be a very questionable decision.
Kathleen, if I could ask you to continue on that topic, how is your organization thinking about historic liability for climate change?
Well, luckily we don't have a ton of it, as our fleet, our generation fleet is largely nuclear, wind, a little bit of solar and gas. So on the scale of things, we are fairly light on that. But I think that it has become, as I said, both a big issue, but also has become a real essential point of negotiation or something that we can give as we try to have these federal negotiations or federal legislative packages. We belong to an organization called the Climate Leadership Conference, or CLC. Sorry, so many acronyms in this world. Nothing as fun as WOTUS, but definitely. So this is essentially a legislative proposal that we've gotten a lot of interesting and large bedfellows together. But it's a carbon tax proposal with a few other prongs. But the fourth one that got Exxon, Shell, Conoco, a few others to the table to put their names on it was addressing some of the historic liability, which the ethicist in me probably says is not great, but the futurist in me says we have to get these people to play along, and if that's a give, I think we just need to remember it's a very powerful give, and we should get something big in exchange.
Well, that liability question is one of the parts of the problem on the Pace Environmental Law moot court later this month. So you might have students that will be able to answer this.
So I'm going to play off of the bottom-up theme. So right now there's a lot of inaction at the federal level. Can we address this major problem without the federal government? I mean, can the bottom-up approach work alone?
I mean, I think that was probably covered in the introductory talk, that you can get very far with voluntary action, but at some point you need to level the playing field. I spent 22 years working for the Department of Environmental Protection, and we actually had companies that would come in and say, we're challenging you on this regulation, but they really don't care whether this regulation is implemented or not, provided it's implemented fairly and levelly across everybody in the business, so it doesn't create inequity. There's always going to be companies that will see an opportunity to cut corners, and without bedrock of regulation to stop that, having all the Amazons and Googles doing what they can isn't going to get you where you need to go.
Yeah, because I mean, all the bottom-up action is so important, and it really is going to, New Jersey and other states like that are definitely blazing a path to show everyone what can be done. Things like RGGI, TCI are going to be really important when we finally sit down to write some federal regs again. But without federal action, it's not enough and ends up being very disjointed. When you talk about the issue of competitive advantage, a year and a half ago, my perfect example was always, Pennsylvania versus New Jersey and back again, but I guess that has flipped, so we can talk about it. Like, you have power plants on either side of the Schuylkill with completely different cost structures, participating in a regional market. So the one that's doing well and is putting on controls is going to lose to the one across the river that doesn't have any controls. Traditional pollutant example, but it works for kind of this idea that if you just have a state-by-state approach, there's always going to be an opportunity to game the system for the lowest common denominator. And then it's just, when it's not involving the whole of the federal government, there's still so many opportunities for these perverse incentives. Today's our earnings call day, so it's a good opportunity to talk about the idea that, we as a company were founded under the expectation of a coming carbon price. So we made business decisions to kind of pull together our low and zero carbon fleet and make it run more efficient so that we would make money under a carbon price. It's been 19 years and we're still waiting. But I think as far as this idea of, in addition to the state-by-state regs, like, we work in states that are doing really good things, but we're still held to the standards of Wall Street, who cheers every time we try to shut down a nuclear plant that avoids the emissions of as many as 20 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. For scale, Pennsylvania's emissions in total are about 100. So these are really big resources that we're losing, and the financial incentive out in the world, lacking a federal structure that promotes good long-term decisions, really wants us to make bad long-term decisions.
Right. I mean, I do think it is the role of the government to help provide that consistency, and you're right, state by state. And sometimes that's, having different standards is creating uncertainty, and sometimes that's a tactic, right? We look back at what happened with microbeads, right? So there was a very big push at the state level and the local level to ban microbeads in personal care products and all sorts of things, and the federal level was like, the lobbying industry around those companies were just very opposed to it. But then they started realizing, oh my gosh, we're going to have to start doing all this sort of packaging and manufacturing, and they're like, okay, we're on board. They then went over to the federal government and legislation, and now we have the micro beads ban, the law that was passed in 2017, and that was industry, understanding where things were headed. So yeah, I do think the government can help address that. We established, we're doing the laws and the standards can drive it, but we also, are kind of driving the market for better or worse, and that is something that's happening in RGGI. There's also tax credits, about electric cars, solar, offshore wind. We have a renewable energy credits market in New Jersey that we talked a little bit about. And then there's also this purchasing power where local governments, including the town I'm in, we're trying to ban with other municipalities to have a larger purchasing power segment and saying we want more renewable energy in our portfolio. Here's what we're bringing to the table, come and bid it. So, I think at all levels, the governments can drive and address climate change. And so that's, I think, where we're headed.
Great. Debbie, if I could pick on you again for a second, and I think Kathleen touched on this a little bit, but so what are some of the consequences with New Jersey now rejoining RGGI? And you have Pennsylvania currently not doing anything. What are some of the consequences of one state putting a price on carbon and another state not?
Right. I didn't even get to this. So I want to challenge, if I may, Kathy, your idea that a company that is putting controls on, I think you said it loses out to the company that doesn't. Well, under a RGGI model, where New Jersey's in the same electric grid as Pennsylvania, PJM, when we were doing our modeling for what cap we're going to propose for New Jersey, which is proposed right now at 18 for the year million tons, and you can and this is just with existing facilities in state, with a lot permitting through the permitting phase, but so. We found, right, if you start lowering the cap and you make the allowance potentially that the power facilities are going to have to purchase go up because it's more valuable, they'll need more, and that's done on the auction, the RGGI auction. It's going to power down the cleaner plants and power up the dirtier plants in Pennsylvania because the market is going to have leakage or a distribution shift of what comes online because it's a price-based electric market. And so I think that's just something that we got a lot of comments on because it's intuitive. People put the cap as low as possible, but then if we're powering up plants that are dirty upwind from us, that's worse for our people in New Jersey, and that's where we're trying to strike. So I think there is a disadvantage to not having a state like Pennsylvania in a marketing scheme like that, and kind of just to give a counterpoint of the idea that the plants that don't have this sort of mechanism around them are at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree with anything you said because that would be dumb for my career. But I think that also that's not how we work in New Jersey. It's at the DEP. You can say whatever you want. But I think that is an important dynamic to talk about. But I would be remiss if I didn't follow it through of the, it's the yes and. Yes, if we put a significant carbon price, and really any carbon price given how efficient the market is, in New Jersey and nothing in Pennsylvania. It's the same dynamic we have now of there's a carbon price above and below both of those states. And you do see leakage, which is a terrible word for an important concept of where if, in this example, so if there's a $4 a ton carbon price in New Jersey and 0 in Pennsylvania, all other costs being equal, electricity generation is going to occur in Pennsylvania because electricity is such a dynamic real-time market that any little change in price can really shift where the generation happens. So yes, that will happen if all you do is put in a carbon price in New Jersey and not in Pennsylvania. However, I think that there's an important opportunity/challenge, but more opportunity here is going back to your original RGGI legislation. New Jersey has an obligation to deal with this, and one way you could deal with this is just lowering that price enough so it doesn't change dispatch, or you can take advantage of the regional PJM grid that is about to have 4 different states with carbon price in it, and deal with leakage mechanisms through the electricity market. For better or for worse, RGGI, unfortunately, for the environment, only covers power plants, but it means that you do have all the tools of PJM at your disposal to try to mitigate those leakage effects. But they're big and they're real, and I guess this is a theme that we keep coming back to. It's just because it's hard, we shouldn't try. We should try to make the partial measures work as best as we can.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys one more question before I try to get some audience questions. So in your mind, through your work, are there any states or countries that can serve as models, that they're providing the certainty that folks want and really making an effective effort towards climate change regulation?
I mean, from Pennsylvania's perspective, I think we can certainly look to what the RGGI states are doing. There's definitely lessons learned to take from that, and there would be some significant advantages for Pennsylvania to participate in RGGI. That being said, having a carbon price alone isn't necessarily enough to get where you need to go. It looks like we are going to need some sort of an economy-wide cap, and which would translate to a more significant price on carbon. I think there's a lot of lessons that we can take from different countries and things they do that work, and I don't think there is really any lack of ideas on what to do. I think it's a lack of will to actually do them that's the main problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could throw this turn this challenge into an opportunity if the Crown is still out there for best jurisdiction on these issues. I think the obvious answer is probably a lot of the European countries of what they've done on some of the carbon trading and other commitments around getting rid of coal. But they come in from a different playing field. I think that at the risk of having a homey advantage here, I think that as far as the scale of the problem and kind of the fossil fuel-based economy, this region is if we follow through on what we're working on expanding RGGI, on TCI, a lot of these other sort of moving beyond just the power sector into transportation in particular, are really important. You have to give California credit for the scale of what they're trying to tackle, and in this case, first mover disadvantage is real, and they're working through how to make those policies more efficient. But I think they really are the first ones that have tried to comprehensively tackle emissions. So while they're not as far along as they want to be, they at least want to be reducing emissions a lot and have one of the first economy-wide programs.
I mean, tack on that, I think California, at least for us in New Jersey, is showing us the way, and I really wanted to tell this story because it's a uncertainty panel about CAFE standards. So this is the mileage standards on cars. So New Jersey is a state that adheres to the California standard, which for a long time, and it's still, a higher standard than anything that was happening on the national level. Well, under the last federal administration, and keep in mind, I'm on the more policy end of law, so I'm going to really paraphrase this. But in the last federal administration, there was a push that maybe we can get this standard at a federal level, right? Bring the California standard, and there were some obligations there or assertions, and California amended their rule and said you either adhere to the California standard or a federal rule, and there was an assumption that would be an equivalent. And there was backing from the industry and the regulated community around that. Well, a new administration came in, and the industry, which had previously just supported this initiative, came back to the federal government and lobbied to undo it. And not only did the Trump administration say, oh yeah, we're taking a look at it, they're like, we're going to just completely roll everything back. So they even went further than I think industry had been wanting to go. And so I went out for New Jersey to California. The California Air Resources Board, CARB, had a hearing where they were amending their rule to take out this reference over to federal standards, because we they could tell the federal standard was not going to go where they wanted to go, and we didn't want to bring all of these states that adhere to the California standards to do it. And so some of the associations and the car manufacturing companies came and testified, and it was so interesting to me because the car board, which is not just state regulators, they were having none of it. They were like, you guys created this uncertainty with the regulations. We don't stop telling us to delay doing our rules. You're the ones who ran back to the federal government. We had a plan, and you're the ones who caused it. So when we first were being invited to come on the panel, a lot of the questions were about the government creating uncertainty with regulations. And I just wanted to make this point that sometimes the regulated community creates a lot of uncertainty around regulations, and that was just, to me, such a crystal example of how that could happen, and I just really wanted to tell that story. So California, yeah.
Pennsylvania's opted into California standards as well.
Yeah. So.
And just to turn the bandwagon, we are on the right side of history here, suing that action. Because of business decisions we've made to help these states achieve their zero-emission vehicle mandates.
A little over 5 minutes remaining. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. If not, I still have more questions.
So in a lot of the United States panel, I think we were either explicit or at least there was a strong sense of like, don't count on this being resolved anytime soon. Am I reading too much? It sounds like you perceive climate to be more of a transition that it's going through, and maybe there will be a fair amount of certainty, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, but you don't necessarily see permanent regulatory uncertainty here? Is that reading too much into what you all are saying?
I think, well, to some extent, regulatory certainty is incompatible with democracy. So, and I think the California story tells us that. I think we're moving towards more certainty on climate change, and eventually, even if the U.S. continues to lag and stay behind, we're seeing like international business obligations where companies, if they want to do business in other jurisdictions, these are the criteria that they're going to have to meet. And whether or not the U.S. forces them to, we're going to see shifts in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I'm just stealing your quote, because that's exactly right. I mean, I think we hope that there are more regulations in the future in this area, but until somehow it's obviated through technological change or whatever, you're going to continue to face this pushback. The California cars example is great because it was actually solved. Regulatory uncertainty was solved. We see this in the power sector too, is regulatory uncertainty around mercury was solved. And then, the administration changes, and as long as there's someone that has an economic interest in blowing it up for whatever reason, whether it's just the certainty they don't want to be covered or their product is being used less, there is always going to be this push against the certainty if it's not the certainty they want. So until it's up, there are still rules on the books that you have to start taking your car apart if a horse goes by, but technology has moved on. So until we've moved on from incentives against taking action on climate change, I think it's something we're always going to have to keep buttressing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty certain. So it's happening. We've got to deal with it, and we're going to deal with it in New Jersey.
Is there any movement in industry to unite to push for more of a carbon tax across industries instead of just say one sector? We see, I'm speaking as an individual, but where I come from, I work at EPA, but as an individual, I see need for a carbon tax. And in my experience, I've seen it has been expressed to me from various industries the need for a carbon tax, particularly the recycling industry would like to see a carbon tax because they have an unlevel playing field that it's really causing a lot of problems right now.
Yeah, that last sentence could apply to so many industries right now. I'm inherently an optimist, but I have been around this radio a couple of times. There is a sort of widespread grass tops push for a carbon tax right now. Also some of the grassroots that you're seeing through the Citizens Climate Change Lobby. The meeting in the middle and the degree to which people are committed to it, I mean, economists have always preferred it. We've always said that that was one of the many things that would work. Just however you get a price signal in here will start accelerating a lot of emission changes. I don't know if we can connect the grass tops and the grass roots yet, so I wouldn't bank on it like next week, but I think there is a lot of at least understanding that that would be a really good first policy.
Although it is inherently a regressive tax.
Depends what you do with money.
Just the tax itself, it takes more policy beyond that.
Yeah, and just to point on that, the other thing that we're really looking at and trying to have the conversations with the right people in New Jersey is the equity issue on all of this. We are getting a big push in New Jersey about mandatory emissions reductions for certain power plants and trying to do that under RGGI in certain disproportionately impacted communities. And I think as we people keep looking at cap and trade or some kind of tax, like the equity issue has to be front and center, and that's something we really have to think about when we're implementing programs like this.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, so I think we have just 1 more minute, so I'll finish with just one more question. So, I mean, like a lot of things these days, climate change is a heavily partisan issue. So, is there anything that your organizations are doing? You're all three of you are coming from different sectors. Is your organization doing anything to engage with lawmakers from both parties, to engage with members of the public, to educate? Is there anything that you three are doing?
Oh, I mean, we already had success in this last legislative session with implementing a commercial property assessed clean energy bill, which had more than half of the Senate co-sponsoring. So really strong bipartisan support. And this was a model that it wasn't requiring any money to come out of the general fund. It was presented to the conservative lawmakers as, here's a way that you can bring a new business opportunity into your district. And there were certainly some that voted against it because it mentioned renewable energy and they will oppose anything. But you can appeal to even very conservative lawmakers with that. This session, we're talking to the same lawmakers about a community solar bill. We're one of the states that doesn't have community solar now. We say, here, there's businesses sitting out there that want to come and work in Pennsylvania. They just need a model that they can work under. And we're getting a lot of response from both parties.
Yeah, I mean, living and working in DC, I'd be inherently unemployable if I couldn't work across the aisle. So I think we've talked about kind of the carbon tax that we've been working on. That's almost exclusively a Republican outreach endeavor at this point. But I think the other example that I should throw out here with my last couple seconds is in several states we've achieved getting kind of a REC-like device to support nuclear power. And that has really been a across the aisle sort of conglomeration of interests. You have the environmental interests that are strongly democratic. You have the kind of the jobs and the property tax base and the technology supports that have been slightly more Republican, and all of that has been on a bipartisan basis when it was legislative.
Right. I mean, obviously, our legislative work is really run through our governor's office, and we're working right now at the department trying to play catch up a bit with the education component for folks in New Jersey. I mean, I use the example of, like, I grew up in Michigan, and I'm like, why would my mom in Michigan care about global warming? And so, right, until you start thinking maybe about it that way, and why, this behavioral change that we're all, I think, ultimately going to need, I think that's something we're really looking at the department, is how we can make sure the data gets out. We are the keeper of a lot of information, and how we make that accessible to folks that want to use it for a lot of amplifying the information and education.
Thank you very much for your time.